This week is very important for central banks around the world. The US Federal Reserve meeting will end on Wednesday. On Tuesday, the Bank of Japan is expected to announce an adjustment of the Japanese monetary policy. And on Thursday, we are waiting for the decision of the Bank of England. As you can see, there is a busy week ahead for the markets. Today, we will analyze one of the key topics that is at the intersection of geopolitics and economics. And it already has a noticeable impact on both global financial markets, such as cryptocurrencies, and the decisions of central banks. How does the growing tensions after Israel's strike on Iran affect the global economy? Why are central banks, such as the Fed and the Bank of England, in no hurry to cut interest rates, even despite the formal slowdown in inflation? That's what we're going to talk about today. At the end of last week, Israel attacked Iran's nuclear facilities. In response, Tehran conducted one of the largest rocket attacks on Israeli territory. Amid the aggravation of the situation, a number of countries have called on their citizens to leave the territories of Israel and Iran. The region was on the verge of a large-scale conflict involving many countries. World markets reacted to this almost immediately, primarily with a jump in oil prices. Already in the first hours after the strike, the brand's quotes jumped by 12% to almost $80 per barrel. But then a correction followed. By the opening of trading on Monday, the price had dropped to $73. This decrease was due to the statements of the Russian Academy of Sciences about the readiness to resume US nuclear negotiations and abandon the creation of nuclear weapons. However, hopes for de-escalation quickly faded, and oil began to grow again. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu openly expressed distrust of these promises and readiness to continue military operations. Donald Trump also strengthened his position, saying that Iran should not possess nuclear weapons. In fact, he supported the Israeli line of forceful pressure. Thus, high geopolitical uncertainty remains, which increases volatility in the commodity and currency markets, directly affecting the decisions of central banks and overall financial stability. Now, sharp fluctuations in oil prices are no longer just news headlines. For the monetary authorities, this is a factor of direct pressure on inflation expectations and monetary policy, especially in conditions when the economies of the leading countries are balancing between business downturns and the need to maintain control over inflation. If the escalation continues, the risks may increase by a multiple. Deutsche Bank analysts are already allowing oil prices to rise above $120 per barrel. If the military confrontation drags on, J.P. Morgan voices an even tougher script. In the absence of a truce in the coming days, the price may reach $130 per barrel. At the same time, the accompanying signals also increase the alarm. So, in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the key energy corridors of the world, they began to record the disappearance of GPS signals. And this happened immediately after a certain incident with ships, as reported by the Global Company for Marine Risks of Embryo. So what does all this mean for central banks? Let's start with the US Federal Reserve, and then look at the situation in a broader global context. At this week's monetary policy meeting, the US Federal Reserve will face a classic problem. On the one hand, the latest official data indicate a slowdown in inflation. On the other hand, there are more and more signs that the labor market is starting to lose ground. The pace of job creation is declining, and wage growth is gradually slowing down. Thus, the Fed is again facing a difficult choice: to continue a tough policy for the final victory over inflation, which is already close to the target, or to begin to ease the pressure so as not to strangle the already slowing economy. Both of these choices will directly affect, among other things, the cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. In theory, everything looks perfect for lowering rates. Inflation is slowing down, the labor market is cooling down, and a cycle of decline can begin. However, a new geopolitical shock has blown this strategy of the central bank to smithereens, due, one might say, to the Israeli-Iranian sabotage of this strategy. The situation for central banks has become much less predictable and dangerous. This is not the first time we have seen this, and it is likely we will see it again. If we start cutting rates right this week, against the background of an oil shock, it will look like a very dangerous signal for the markets, because it can trigger a secondary wave of inflation. For example, companies will start raising prices for services, workers will demand higher wages, and then a chain reaction. An inflationary spiral. The risks are getting higher every day, and now, in fact, everything depends on the Trump administration. Either they will be able to extinguish this conflict, which in fact was provoked in his first term, or everything can go into a spiral from which there will be no easy way out. And the consequences will affect not only the oil market, but also the entire world economy. I repeat, the market is now laying down the first scenario and expects that this conflict will be fleeting and will be quickly resolved by negotiations. But I would say that diplomacy looks like a rather weak point so far. After all, if the negotiations on the nuclear program had been conducted honestly and constructively a few years ago, most likely we would not have been at this point at all. But no matter how events develop in the Middle East, central banks have already made it clear that they will be extremely cautious. Rates, inflation, markets. Everything now depends on the data they receive. And even more, from foreign policy risks, which are multiplying every day. And make no mistake, what we are witnessing today. This is the result of many years of failed political decisions, geopolitical aggression, and a whole campaign of fear-mongering. The global situation is getting worse, and everyone feels it, from ordinary consumers to the largest financial regulators. And now imagine, against the background of all this, there is also a political circus inside the United States itself. Donald Trump has entered the game again, and this is how he literally recently walked around the Fed. And personally under the heat of Paul for not lowering the rate. Here is his quote: "If we cut rates by 1 percentage point, we will save $300 billion, if by 2. Then already $600 billion. This is almost equivalent. But now we are spending this money just because of one person." I explained to him, if inflation is rising, keep the rates. But there is no inflation. We have lowered prices, lowered gasoline prices, and continue to reduce them. Sounds convincing, maybe. But it also shows how much politicized absolutely everything related to monetary policy, financial markets, and even Bitcoin has become. The Fed seems to be an independent body, but it is under constant pressure from the White House, then from Wall Street, and now Trump's election rhetoric, because the midterm elections are waiting for us soon. And Bitcoin, in turn, is highly dependent on Trump's statements. By the way, Trump launched some kind of crypto smartphone a la Sala on a smartphone, only obviously connected with Trump's memcoin. What follows from all this? Plans to reduce rates have not yet been cancelled, but they have definitely been put on pause. Whether it's the Fed, the Bank of England, or any other central bank. Now they have all taken the same position. We are watching and waiting. Events are unfolding too quickly, and the future is now determined literally by a narrow circle of people who are at the very top of power, intelligence, and the army. Everyone else can only try to predict something, but their forecasts will remain just guesses. And this whole situation, another harsh reminder of how intertwined the economy, geopolitics, and financial markets are today. Any missile, any attack in the Middle East. This is not just a local conflict. These are oil prices. This is inflation. This is the fate of interest rates. This is the decision of central banks. These are stock and cryptocurrency markets, and ultimately these are our wallets. The fate of Bitcoin against this background also looks ambiguous and depends on whether it will be perceived as digital gold, a haven in case of geopolitical events. If there is, then its price will repeat the movement of gold. And all this happens at the very moment when he is at the most important point of the cycle, right on the upper boundary of this global channel. In previous cycles, it found a peak just at this upper boundary. How do you think the conflict in the Middle East will end? Has Bitcoin reached a peak in this cycle, or will it go into a super cycle for the first time in its history?